Hello, everybody. Welcome. This is the Lemkin Genocide in the Modern World webinar. We are going to take about a minute or so for everybody to come in. So please bear with us while we are waiting for everybody to appear. Thank you. Hello, everybody. Just again, this is a webinar on Lemkin, Genocide and the Modern World. And we are waiting for people to just show up. So please give us another minute. Thank you. Again, welcome to our webinar on Lemkin, Genocide and the Modern World. And we're still waiting for people to join. So please give us one more minute. And we will start in 1 minute. Thank you so much. All right, my phone is saying 12:02. So we're going to start. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Allow me to extend a very warm welcome to all of you. We are delighted that you have joined us. Dobry wieczór Państwu, witamy Państwa bardzo serdecznie. I also want to welcome our very distinguished panel. We are honored, delighted, and grateful to them for accepting our invitation to speak today. My name is Elizabeth Zechenter. I am a visiting scholar at Emory University and a president of Jagiellonian Law Society, which organized this webinar. I will be your moderator today. And I am delighted to introduce to you our first webinar in our new series called Polish and Central European Contributions to International Law. Now, webinars like this take many people and many organizations to make them happen. So allow me to thank many people who contributed in various shapes or forms or co-sponsor this particular webinar. And so I will list them in no particular order, but let me thank University of Pennsylvania, Department of Russian and East European Studies, Kościuszko Foundation and Kościuszko Foundation Philadelphia chapter, Seton Hall Law School and Seton Hall School of Diplomacy, Temple Law School International Law Society, Center for American Studies of University of Poznań, International Human Rights Committee and Women Interest Committee of American Bar Association, New Jersey State Bar Association, New York State Bar Association, Ukrainian Bar Association. Special thanks go to Warsaw University, Jagiellonian University, and the deans who advertised that seminar, as well to the deans of Warsaw and Krakow Bar. And finally to Professor Philip Sanz, who couldn't join us, but he made very many helpful suggestions. Now, the word about logistics. This webinar consists of two parts. Part 2 will take place at the end of January. This webinar is recorded, so if you have questions, please use Q&A function. That's important. I will collect those questions and I will ask them of our speakers. In addition, we are Jagiellonian Law Society is a certified legal education provider, so we are offering 1.5 hours of the CLE credits. So if you want them, please write to us. Now, let me set up a scene for you. We are going to be talking about 3 different concepts today. First, we're going to introduce to you a figure of a lawyer, Rafael Lemkin, who is known as the father of the concept of genocide as an international crime. And there are actually many Lemkins. If you read about Lemkin, you realize that there are many, many Lemkins. There is a Polish Lemkin. There is Polish-Jewish Lemkin and Jewish-Polish Lemkin. There is Lemkin the internationalist and Lemkin the Zionist. There is Ukrainian Lemkin, there is Lithuanian Lemkin, and so forth. And we have a Professor Irvin-Erickson who will make sense to all of those Lemkins for us. But just briefly, for 1 minute, Lemkin was born in the city of Lviv, and in Ukrainian, Lvov in Polish, or Lemberg when it was under Habsburgs. And he studied there, he studied in Heidelberg, and he was a Polish prosecutor in Warsaw. He represented Poland in many international situations and meetings. He defended Poland in 1939 when we were attacked by Germany and later by Russia. He's hit 6 months. He was wounded, from what I understand, while defending Poland, and then he escaped to Sweden, later on to United States. He was twice nominated for Nobel Peace Prize, and he was the man who really understood the ideas that certain groups can be prosecuted just because they are a member of certain group. So that's one concept. The second concept is international law. Now, international law existed for many, many years, but really, we can trace it. Actually, we can even trace it to Hammurabi, but we can trace it to, let's say, ancient Greece and Rome. There was a flowering of international law during the Renaissance, which was like a period of the major first globalization. But in general, the states were given the primacy and the power. They were seen as sovereign, and in Latin it was known as cuius regio eius religio. In other words, you had full power over citizens of your state. But it was the atrocity of the Second World War that made people realize that we cannot give states entire control over individuals, and hence the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was born, the United Nations Charter, United Nations organizations, and so forth. And it was during the Nuremberg trials, when the top Nazis were being prosecuted for the crimes they committed, that the concept of genocide and crimes against humanity became kind of part of the international law in a very major way. And finally, let me add the third element to this complex mix, which is the Russian aggression on Ukraine. As we all know, on February 24th this year, Russia invaded the sovereign state of Ukraine in violation of Article 2 of the Charter of United Nations, the Helsinki Accord, and a whole slew of international treaty, United Nations declarations, and committed tons of crimes. Crimes, from act of aggression to crimes against peace, war crimes, arguably genocide, or crimes against humanity. So this complex mix requires a lot of understanding, and we have perfect people to show you the nuance of all those complexities. We have 4 distinguished speakers, and let me introduce you to our first speaker, Dr. Doug Irvin-Erickson, who is assistant professor at the George Mason University in Washington, D.C., and the director of the Genocide Prevention Program in the Carter School. Professor Erickson has extremely extensive experience in the field of genocide studies and mass atrocities. He has experience with Congo, Burundi, Cambodia, Myanmar, Argentina, and now Ukraine. And he has written on genocide, religion and violence, human security, etc. His first book, which was on Lemkin and the concept of genocide, and published by University of Pennsylvania Press in 2017, was very well received. And it's certainly worth reading, and we'll post the references to his work on our website. And he's currently writing his second book about dying in the age of thoughtlessness, genocide, terror, and conflict resolution. Now, Professor Erickson is actually not a lawyer. He has a doctorate in global affairs and master's degree in English literature. And he is joining us from Turkey today. So he will talk about Lemkin, many Lemkins, and the Genocide Convention, and how can we make sense of all of this. So with all that, Doug, the floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you so very much. This is really a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for this kind invitation to join. And one of the great things about Zoom is we can be with each other from so many different places. So to our colleagues in Ukraine right now, my heart certainly goes out, and I wish you all of the best thoughts that I can wish tonight and into the future. So I want to begin with a little warm-up exercise, if I can be permitted to do that. Put on my little professor hat. So I'm going to share my screen, and I put a link into the chat here, which I believe it's only available to panelists. I'd ask if one of the hosts can make it visible for everybody else. And let me share the screen now with this warm-up exercise. So this is a website I created for the classes I teach so that I don't have to force my students to buy my book, and then they don't have to pretend like they read it. So this is a joke, sarcasm. But a little warm-up exercise that I want to do. So on the one side of the screen, people can see this, we have the United Nations Treaty, which was, the date up there is 1951. This is when it's ratified, but 1948 is when it's when it's passed with a unanimous vote. And then on the other side of the screen, we have Axis Rule in Occupied Europe, which is this is chapter 9 from Axis Rule in Occupied Europe. This is the book where Lemkin first coins the word genocide. Now, what's important about this book is that it was published in 1944, but Lemkin delivered the manuscript to the publisher in early 1942, about 1 month after the Wannsee Conference, which is where the Nazi regime developed the policy of the final solution, which was what historians recognize as the moment when the Nazi regime solidified German policy towards eradication of European Jewry. And the concentration camp system turned into the death camp system and so forth. So Lemkin coined the word genocide, however, in the winter of 1941, late 1941, before 1942. And this is significant because Lemkin's original definition of genocide, mass killing, was only one subcategory of 8 other categories of ways in which genocide could be committed. So killing, in a very interesting way, had very little to do with Lemkin's conception of genocide. And that's really important, I guess, if we're talking about, sort of the history of ideas and so forth. But where this becomes interesting for international law starts to take shape around here. So if we look down towards the bottom of the screen, I would ask students to read this and tell me what they notice the differences are between the two. I would like to point your attention to the bottom of Axis Rule in Occupied Europe, to the bottom of the page, where Lemkin talks about genocide as a crime of colonization, where the imprint of the national pattern upon populations of the oppressed is the first phase, followed by the second phase. The first phase is destruction of the national patterns of the oppressed. The second phase is the imposition of the national patterns of the oppressed. And genocide can be completed upon a population that is allowed to remain in the territory. So genocide for Lemkin can occur without a single death taking place, right? And he calls this a program of colonization. Now, what's interesting here is that Lemkin's definition of a nation is not the definition of a nation that we get in international law and political theory through the English and the French tradition. It comes from Zionist thinking. It comes from particularly Polish thinking that he's engaged with. But also in a very important way, he's drawing on, for those of you who know this, the work of Karl Renner, the Austrian great political figure, and Otto Bauer, the social democratic theorist, which saw nations as mental processes. And so Lemkin defines nations as literally communities that share a mind, and thus one person can belong to many nations at once. No individual can ever represent a single nation, and we all have many nations inside of us. Lemkin defined late into his work that a nation could be considered card players and gamblers. You could conceivably, for Lemkin, commit genocide against criminals. This was significant for Lemkin because Lemkin first began to work in the area of international law as it concerned Soviet crimes and Soviet penal code. And what he noticed in his first 2 books, in 27 and 28, is that the Soviet Union took the penal code, the domestic penal code, and it criminalized forms of national consciousness that it determined were enemies of the revolution. And through the penal code, directed the force of the state, physical, but also the massive force that states bring to bear in conflict and in governance towards the eradication of perceived enemies. So by 1933, Lemkin begins to formulate these ideas around what he calls barbarity and vandalism. He gets denounced by Stalin's henchman, the prosecutor general of the Soviet of the USSR, Andrei Vyshinsky. Andrei Vyshinsky, says Lemkin has a long career of trying to outlaw revolutionary violence. And if he had his way, he would just ensnare the Soviet Union in this bourgeois enterprise of international criminal law under the pretext of defending culture and civilization. This was the excuse. So this is an interesting part of this here, because Lemkin, of course, he makes his money as a tax lawyer. He writes many more books in international commerce law and economic conflict than he does in political violence and things about minority protection and such. And he sort of he comes and goes. He puts them to the side, he comes back, puts them to the side, comes back. And he's making his living as an economic lawyer. So by 33, he writes this article, gets denounced by the Soviet Union. He says, maybe I prefer to live a happy life. He goes back to writing his stuff around economics. The Soviet Union invades, right, after Germany invades. And now Lemkin's life is in danger on both sides of the divide. He's Jewish, so he can be killed by the Nazis. And he's been denounced by the prosecutor general of the Soviet Union as an enemy of the revolution. That can put you in a lot of danger. And he escapes, right? He flees, winds up through convoluted ways in the US. And at the US, he shows up at the United Nations. Now, he's got this idea of genocide. I'm going to skip over Nuremberg for a second. He's got this idea of genocide, which is about destruction of nationalities, right? And he calls it a colonial crime. Well, the British and the Americans don't want to outlaw anything close to it, so that could make colonization illegal. And Wyszynski recognizes Lemkin right away, and he wants nothing to do with it. And what you get then is, this is what my book is about, and the link I put in the chat is just a condensed version of the book that's debated by several scholars in the field. So it's an easy place to digest a lot of this. But what you get then through 2 years of diplomatic hashing out back and forth is you get on the left, you get a treaty that great powers can live with. And really crucially here is we have all the documents. Anton Weiss-Wendt, the researcher from Norway, has found in Ukrainian archives the Soviet documents where Stalin and Wyszynski pored over every draft of the UN Genocide Convention in their red and their blue pencils to make sure that nothing in the law could be applied to the Soviet side. Now, at the end of this diplomacy, the US felt that it had actually been outmaneuvered in the bargaining tables. And so the very diplomats like John Foster Dulles, who supported the Genocide Convention with reservations, of course, went immediately to Congress and told the Senate not to ratify the treaty that they had signed at the UN because the US had actually lost a lot of ground, and that the treaty as signed would expose the US to prosecution for genocide, and that the Soviets had actually outmaneuvered them. Now, what were the Americans so worried about? Well, the Americans were worried about Jim Crow, right? The American Indian reservation system, the treatment of minorities. And the French were worried about the colonies. The Swedes were worried about the Sami. The South African delegation said if we outlaw genocide as Lemkin conceives of it, we would not be able to deal with backwards peoples. In other words, they wanted to maintain the right to commit genocide against backwards peoples, who is an apartheid racist regime. What they meant was people who had black skin, Africans. New Zealand worried that outlawing genocide would prevent them from managing their cannibal population, which is, horrifically racist language, right? And so what you see here is this process where great powers are suddenly trying to rewrite this treaty in a way where they can live with it. So you'll notice several things, really, really important parts of this here. If you focus in on A through E, you have these sort of conditions. These are the acts that constitute genocide legally, right? Well, the women's NGOs at the UN were the first group that supported Lemkin. Lemkin wrote a lot about Nazi Germany's policies of sexual violence, forced impregnation, which is a terrible euphemism for what we now call rape, all sorts of other forced marriages and so forth. If you notice, those drop out, they're not included. The only thing you get from that group of sexual crimes and sexual violence is the category of imposing measures, D, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. So this was something that by the time it got to the ICTR and the Rwandan tribunals, right, the judge, the Swedish judge, came to the conclusion that actually we can read back into the Genocide Convention the very notion that rape is a crime of genocide because it was erased for political reasons, right? Now we have here forcible transfer of children from one group to another. This is actually something that could be prosecuted today with the Russian war in Ukraine, I think. I think there's good evidence to prosecute genocide on this. But what about forced deportations, right? So it's the crime of genocide to remove children, but what about the adults? Well, this sure feels a lot like the familiarity of the Holocaust to me. There was a lot of forcible transfer of adults. But at the time, there was great concern that this would actually implicate charges of genocide that were recurring in the Middle East around questions of Greek and Turkish repatriations, both the Greeks and Turkish side. Of course, that brings up the mandate system in Palestine and Pakistan, the British mandate system. So there's all sorts of questions there about forcible transfer of adults. And that gets deleted, but the children remain. And it goes on and on like this, on and on. So Stalin removes anything that can have anything to do with hunger, right? Stalin removes it. Now you look back at the groups up here, the groups that can be that genocide could be committed against. And what you have here is a political negotiation about what groups would be allowed. Well, economic groups are not there. And we have all of the British cables documenting what the Americans were saying to the British. The British declassified this. The Americans wanted to preserve the right to wage economic warfare against populations. I mean, this is the beginning of the Cold War. We wanted to, destroy economic groups, and the Soviets wanted to do the same thing. And so economic groups are removed. You have political groups. The Brazilian delegate, I have this letter, says if we include political groups as listed under genocide, we would be committing genocide against Latin Americans because it was within our culture to exterminate our political enemies. So the Soviet bloc and the Latin American group of Latin American countries don't want political groups listed there. And it goes on like this. Now, there's one last thing I want to come back to here, which is that, well, there's some fun things here. So for instance, mental harm, the Chinese delegation provides, the Chinese delegation played a crucial role because they were constantly the tie-breaking vote. Mental harm, they defined mental harm the way Lemkin defined nations as mental processes. So they saw mental harm as the way to build back into the Genocide Convention, Lemkin's conception of a nation, which was not, you did that national group that's up there in the top. They knew that the Americans and the French were defining nations according to the legacies of the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the nation state. So they built back mental harm. And because they saw that as primarily the mechanism by which British colonialism worked in the Opium Wars. That becomes incredibly important in the Argentine tribunals, which I'll talk to in a little bit. I got 7 minutes left on my timer, so I'll get there. But what we have here is this process by which genocide itself, the groups that genocide can be committed against are limited, because we want to preserve, as the great powers, we want to preserve, I'm using the metaphorical we here, we want to preserve the right to massive, to sort of exterminate social groups culturally or physically. The acts of genocide are circumscribed so that they could get a list of, A through E that they felt that they themselves were not committing directly. And then there was another mechanism, which was there were two more important negotiating points. The one was this question of intent, which really was important for the great powers to sign on to genocide, had to be a crime of intent. In other words, you could leave the door open for, oops, we accidentally committed genocide. That's not genocide legally. And I'm only slightly exaggerating the tone. These were the letters that the delegates were passing back and forth outside of the official negotiating rooms. If you say this in the negotiating rooms at the UN, you get recorded. And then you're in the preparatory documents, and then it's public knowledge about the debates about international treaties. So these arguments and these debates happened in private letters, they happened in hotel rooms, you can read about them in diaries, and Lemkin has a lot of the notes he took on bar napkins that they passed around the delegates lounge. And so you can retrace the political bargaining that's happening outside of the official rooms. And this was quite frank, the language is quite frank here about this. Now, there's another aspect here, which is the question of genocide. I'm going to scroll up here. Did I include this here? I did not. I cut it off. Okay. It's about individual responsibility for genocide, which is, of course, the famous one. States cannot be held guilty for genocide. There's no collective responsibility here. It's individual responsibility. And at this point, there's a high philosophical justification of this, which was Lemkin's own, and it actually makes sense, which is that you don't want to hold collectivities responsible for genocide because that opens the door to demonizing entire collectivities, right? We do not want to say that Russians as an ethnic group are evil. No, we don't want to say that because that's what we're accusing them of doing to Ukrainians, right? We want to instead say there are specific actors within the Russian state and Russian society that are acting in a way to carry out this policy. And that this policy indeed has a wide sociological basis where people are participating in it in different ways, right? But we want to be very clear that it's not Russia as a group that's evil, right? To do that just opens the door for reciprocal kinds of retaliation and the conflict just sort of lives on and on and on and on. So Lemkin is very, very insistent on holding individuals responsible, not collectivities, to break the cycle. Now, at the same time, if you're Stalin, you love this. You really love this. And why is that? Because you can push legal responsibility to the foot soldiers who carry it out and your middlemen, henchmen who you don't care about anyway, and you can escape prosecution. So that's the backdoor, right? That allows for state sovereignty to play its role. And that's the part where I want to talk about in the last few minutes here, where I think is the most interesting part of Lemkin's ideas, is that Lemkin, by the end of this, actually, he ends his life very sad. Right? His writings, he believes that his work at the UN was a failure. He sees the Genocide Convention as a total betrayal of his ideals. He sees it, he keeps up a brave face in public. So when he talks to reporters, he says the right things. He get rid of the share screen for a second. He gets into these public settings, and he celebrates the Genocide Convention because he's trying to get the U.S. to ratify it. He's trying to work here, but in his private writings, he's actually quite a sense of betrayal. He says, the Genocide Convention is now in the hands of the world statesmen who live in perpetual sin with history, right? Who treat life like currency in a bank. The very American delegates who he convinced to sign a Genocide Convention, not the one he liked, but a Genocide Convention, turned around and urged the Senate not to sign it. These were the people these were people who signed it, right? Their signatures are on the UN documents, and they turn around, they tell the Senate, don't ratify this. So Lemkin is suddenly looking at this and sees his life as a failure, right? He dedicates his efforts to working on the national level, to outlawing genocide at a national level. And this is interesting because this opens the door for genocide in the domestic penal codes, places like Egypt and Cambodia and Argentina, all of which have had very, very interesting experiences prosecuting genocide. But this question of intent and individual responsibility becomes really crucial here. And here's the irony that I would see if I were to look at genocide prosecutions in Ukraine. I would look at a head of state in Russia who is defended by nuclear arms, and no state in the world is going to take seriously the question that Putin can be prosecuted unless Putin's government falls and his own government exposes him to prosecution. In which case you have de facto regime change and civil war and nuclear power, right? This is not a happy scenario for the world. And then you have a sort of level of elites within Russian politics and society that will likely be extended to shield the sovereignty, right? And if you end up with genocide prosecutions of low-level perpetrators, soldiers, individuals, and low-level functionaries, well, then you are actually doing the prosecution of genocide the way Stalin intended it to, which is unbelievably stunning to me. And that to me would be a sad irony. Which I think is worth considering. Now, my personal sense here is that I think when I look at the conflict and the question of legal justice in Ukraine, I think there's actually an incredible opening if Ukrainian domestic law can take seriously the question of genocide under Ukrainian national jurisdiction. This is where the Polish case becomes so fascinating because we have prosecutions of genocide in national courts, right? This is Professor Marcin. Marcinko is going to speak about this. this was a prosecution of genocide before the Nuremberg tribunals, and it actually prosecutes Lemkin's conception of genocide. The Argentine tribunals ruled that Argentinian courts are allowed to interpret the key words of the Genocide Convention, however they wish to interpret it. It's up to them to decide what a nation is. And thus Argentine courts have prosecuted genocide of Argentine military leaders, military junta leaders, for attempts to change the fabric of the nation of Argentina. So it's, you know, it's a really important interpretation. We see similar interpretations in Colombian processes and the trials that have come out of Guatemala, the Colombian TRC process. And in other courts that are working within the framework of the Genocide Conventions, such as the ICCR, have decided that the concept of ethnicity is really troublesome, that the Genocide Convention lays out. So they interpret ethnicity as being simply, if you think that you're a part of this group, then you are a part of that group. So there's a flexibility that exists in international law, yes, to define these key words in the law and exercise the Genocide Convention in different ways. But I think actually under domestic prosecutions of genocide in Ukraine, there's a rich history here where Ukrainian domestic courts and have the ability to define this concept the way they see fit. And this is crucial to me because of the historical links between Lemkin's own work and Soviet atrocities. I mean, he is Russian speaking. He grows up in a Jewish family. Russian is his first language. And then, you know, then Hebrew is a living language for him. Yiddish is the second language. And then he adds Polish. When he's around 3 or 4 years old, he enters into school and learns Polish. And then he picks up, you know, along the way with 14 or 15 other languages, just keeps adding them on because that's what one does in this part of the world. And Lemkin is himself, you know, steeped in this political, cultural, social tradition. And he looks across the border and Soviet atrocities are always fresh in his mind from his 20s. And I think you can look at the historical links here between the conflict and sort of the politics and the conflicts that emerge between Moscow and different sort of centers of, you know, political conflict. And I think the Ukrainian courts can come back and have the freedom to define genocide in a way that's meaningful for the context of their own situation that they're in. And my 2 minutes, I just ran out of time. My timer ran out. Let me conclude by saying that I think that I would urge everybody who's listening and talking to resist the temptation to start talking about genocide as a moral prosecution in the conflict with Russia and Ukraine today. I would urge everybody to sort of recognize that the Genocide Convention was a document written by great powers, and that actually they intended to remove a lot from genocide that they themselves saw their own governments as committing. And I don't tend to look at the Genocide Convention as a moral document for this reason. And so I tend to urge people to understand that there's no legal requirement to prosecute genocide, and that actually genocide prosecutions might not be the best way forward for justice. And if that's the case, then I would encourage collaboration between lawyers and academic departments and museums and civil society groups and memory groups who can then take the idea of genocide and move it into a forum where we start broadening the definition of justice. And especially if we can't prosecute Putin for genocide, then certainly there can be memorials and museums and textbooks and more civil society movements around this. And that's why I would hope that Lemkin's legacy might end up living too. So I hope this has been interesting, worthwhile. I didn't get too much into Lemkin's life, but I know Donna Lee-Frieze will color in the details of Lemkin's fascinating biography when she presents in the which I think she's scheduled to do in the next version of the webinar. So thank you.
Thank you, Doug. This was fascinating and wonderful, and I hope people will have lots of questions to you. So let me introduce to you our next speaker. And as Doug already said, Professor Marcinko will show us how the states can prosecute those crimes within national system. Now, let me tell you a word or two about Professor Marcinko. He's assistant professor and a chair of public international law at the Faculty of Law at the Jagiellonian University of Krakow, my alma mater too. He is a chairman of National Commission for Dissemination of International Humanitarian Law of the Polish Red Cross. He is lecturer and co-organizer of the Polish School of International Humanitarian Law of Armed Conflict. He is member of many organizations, including the International Law Association, International Society of Public Law, International Association of Professionals in Humanitarian Assistance and Protection, author of many books, which we list on our website, so I won't do that, and chapters, articles, and so forth. And he's joining us from Krakow, Poland, and he will tell us on the Polish efforts to prosecute genocide long before the Genocide Convention. So Marcin, the floor is yours. Unmute yourself, please.
Yes, thank you very much for such a nice introduction. And I am also grateful to Professor Irvin-Erickson for making a good ground for my presentation, because right now I'm going to explain and to show you, to present you the development of this concept of genocide, crime of genocide, prepared by Lemkin in practical terms. I mean, in practice of one of the special courts after the Second World War. First, I would like to start my presentation, to share with my presentation. I hope it will work. Okay, I hope that you can, yes.
It works.
And now I think, yes. Well, right now I see only my presentation, but can you see it as well? Is it okay?
If you can put it in the power presentation, kind of presentation mode, that would help. That last button before the volume button at the very bottom of the screen.
This one.
Click on the, it looks like a screen, like a little box.
Actually, I have it here, but I'm not sure whether.
Do you have multiple desktop screens?
Yes.
Yeah, so you just need to share the one where the presentation's up. So go ahead and from the top Zoom navigation, just switch which screen you're sharing.
Okay, I tried again. Just a minute. Oh yes, here. I stop it right now and try again. Okay. Is it visible?
Yes,
we can still see the PowerPoint. It's just not in presentation mode. So on the screen where you have the PowerPoint where you can edit it, there is an option at the top, if you go over to the right, where it says which screen you're sharing.
Here, I hope.
Yeah, but you can choose.
Not this one.
So see where it says automatic, but in Polish on monitor.
I'm not quite sure. I have it in Polish, of course. But,
yeah, I know, but it says it's to the right. It says it's like the Polish word for monitor, just with a Y at the end. Yeah, so where it says automatic.
Oh yes, I see it.
Yeah, so choose, I guess, the other option maybe.
No, nothing happens actually.
What's the other option underneath automatic?
Yes, it's automatic. I can see it.
Just choose, let's click the other one and see if that works.
Okay. Sorry. I can click the button, but okay. Okay, so well, let's start with this.
Yeah, let's start with this. Yeah.
Yes, I would like to take too much time for this presentation. So if you can see it, it's okay. Yeah, again, very glad and honored to participate in this webinar. And my task is to give you some basic information concerning the practical application of still the concept of genocide, because as Professor Irvin-Erickson and Professor Zechenter rightly underlined, it was the situation when the Genocide Convention was not adopted, has not been adopted yet. So before the adoption of this Genocide Convention. Now, a few words about the Tribunal. It was, in Polish, it's Najwyższy Trybunał Narodowy. The Supreme National Tribunal operated from 1946 to 1948. So you can see before the creation of International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg, actually, first two judgments of this tribunal. The result of the judgment were before the Nuremberg Tribunal. And it implemented the Moscow Declaration, the document accepted in 1943, according to which perpetrators guilty of war crimes and other crimes committed during the Second World War would be tried and judged according to the laws of the aggressor states and before their respective courts. So the tribunal was a special court. Well, only for a temporal basis, to deal with 7 high-profile cases, to deal with them. In total, implicated 49 individual defendants targeted as major perpetrators. I would like to add that, well, the main perpetrators were to be judged by this tribunal, established specifically for this reason, but other criminals were to start the trial before competent district courts, including military. But this tribunal was civilian, I mean, not military as in case of Nuremberg Tribunal or Tokyo Tribunal. However, still a special court. We can classify it at the same level as Supreme Court from the perspective of national jurisdictional law. So only 7 high-profile cases. These are these cases. I'm not quite sure. Well, there's no need, I think, to analyze point by point, one by one, each of them. What I would like to underline, to pay your special attention to 3 cases. Why? Because it's about Arthur Greiser, it's about Lee-Frieze, and Amon Leopold Goethe. In these cases, the tribunal underlined specifically the question of genocide committed by those accused in different forms, actually. So in case of Arthur Greiser, it was the tribunal underlined the fact of cultural genocide, which was not included in the Genocide Convention, definition of Genocide Convention. Interestingly, the case of Goethe was about physical genocide, and Rudolph has more complex case, actually. So also physical genocide, but also biological genocide, including so-called, or I wouldn't say quasi-medical experiments in order to prevent birth. So therefore, we have also say that these cases were of genocide, concerning genocide. So, but one more issue I would like to add is that in all these cases, those accused were participants of some institutions, organizations, and according to tribunal, these organizations were treated as criminal, namely the NSDAP, General National Socialist Workers' Party, the Security Detachment, SS, the State Secret Police, Gestapo, and Security Service, SD. So those organizations were treated as criminal, and I think that, well, it doesn't mean that if you are in this organization, you are guilty of genocide. I agree with Professor Irvin-Erickson that it's an individual crime. So, but it was a kind of a starting point, I would say, for those crimes, because being in such organizations, following the orders of the superior orders in such organizations, following the plan prepared, for example, by the NSDAP, people were aware, those accused were aware that they are part of this plan to exterminate some nations, to exterminate some groups because of religion, like Jews, because of nations like Poles, like Czechs, for example. So it was, I think, the starting point, a good point to analyze those cases and say, okay, so you are guilty of genocide. First of all, because of you knew that this activity, this actions, these programs applied by those organizations, you are aware of them, and you were the part of to exercise those plans and those programs. But in fact, in the practice of the Polish court, there were more than just those concrete examples of organizations of criminal character. As you can see here, Polish courts added also, for example, German civil administration and the general government, officials of the administration of the ghetto, in which members of the concentration camp staff in Auschwitz. So in the jurisprudence and practice of Polish courts, there were more institutions and organs of occupying power, German occupying power in Poland, which were treated as criminal. Probably it's also a good point for discussion whether we should think about first to criminalize some organizations, some organs, some institutions, and then to think about whether it might be a genocidal plan realized by those organizations as a criminal. Now, the concept of genocide, as I told you, it was the concept taken from the concept from the ideas of Rafael Lemkin, and Tribunal focused specifically on this new category of crime as a particular kind of crime against humanity. So, because still it was a concept, not a legal definition of genocide, the Tribunal decided to rather to develop it and to point out that it's something more than crime against humanity because of this genocidal intent, first and foremost. And to summarize this Lemkin views, genocide is a synthesis of different acts of persecution and destruction, and the Tribunal accepted it and indicated physical genocide, biological genocide, and cultural genocide. The first example involves undeniable destruction of the group by killing its members using some direct methods like mass executions, or even indirect, imposing harsh conditions, including some limitations on or lack of food. Biological genocide is, it means imposing methods, measures to reduce or prevent the birth rate. It might be a forced separation of men and women in a given targeted group, but also, as I mentioned before, medical experiments, quasi-medical experiments in order to prevent birth. And the last one, cultural genocide, specifically underlined the case of Arthur Greiser, it's like an action which aims at depriving people of their integrity, identity, because of their language, religion, cultural values, which mark them actually as a distinct people, like destruction of their cultural property, processes of denationalization, like Germanization is also one of those elements of this cultural genocide. And especially cultural extermination, cultural genocide appears mainly, and in some cases, like in the Greiser case, first and foremost, was one of the most important elements of the conviction. And it suggests that it's about weeding out of the given group's culture, which might be decisive in determining genocidal intentions. So in its verdicts, of course, the Tribunal underlined some other elements as we understood today because of the definition of genocide. Like in Forster case, for example, it was about German practice of taking children away to the Reich. It was like this forcibly transferred children of the group to another group, which we may find in the Genocide Convention. In the Fischer case, it was about policy of imposing starvation level food rations, like deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole and part. So again, taken from the current definition of genocide. In Auschwitz staff case, it was also action aimed at making life conditions impossible to survive. But three cases I mentioned before are particularly important because of this physical, biological, and cultural genocide to underline. The first case, actually, the Greiser case, the Tribunal referenced to defendants' actions within the framework of crimes against humanity, but as a general totalitarian genocidal attack on the rights of small and medium nations to exist and to have an identity and culture of their own. In the Goethe case, the Tribunal stated straightforwardly that the extermination policy aimed against the Jewish and the Polish nations bore characteristics of genocide, including its biological and cultural dimensions, but first and foremost, it was about physical genocide. And in the verdict against Host, the Tribunal underlined that it was the largest genocide in the history of humankind, which had taken place in Auschwitz-Birkenau. So therefore, the Rudolph Hess case is more complex, more sophisticated, because we have the mixture of the physical genocide, but also this biological genocide, especially with this, let's call it scientific method, like some experiments on prisoners. So those three cases, if you don't mind, I would like to refer to Arthur Greiser first case. He was a Reich governor and the Gauleiter of the National Socialist German Workers' Party of so-called Wartheland or Warthegau. It is the western part of Poland with the main city in Poznan. And Greiser was accused of actions taken mostly because of his orders in order to detriment the Polish state and nation by taking part in abetting, aiding, carrying out this systematic destruction of Polish culture, plunder of Polish cultural heritage, Germanization of the country and Polish people, illegal appropriation of public property, and, well, last but not least, insulting the right of the Polish nation by some propagating its cultural inferiority and low social worth. In particular, well, the tribunal underlined that his deeds, his acts were committed because of his function and power associated with the positions he held. As a high Nazi official and gauleiter of his fatherland, he was accused of the destruction of cultural values and property, and in particular, I will give some examples, if I may. So, systematically suppressed or destroyed Polish research, scientific and academic institutions, including radio, film, theater, and the press. For example, just a minute, I have to find this some notes. Like major dailies edited in particular cities in this territory of Vaterland were immediately shut down. No Polish newspaper were listed in the area of Vaterland. All schools, you know, elementary, high schools, including universities, have been shut down or changed its purpose in order to change its character. Actually, there was also a plan to apply a so-called Polnische Schule, which is a Polish schools, but it has nothing common with, you know, Polish culture, Polish education, and so on. There were schools and to produce slaves, in fact, because in such schools for Poles, for Polish children, they had to learn just to read, to write, to understand German, but, you know, in a very little level, just to understand orders given by the masters, and, well, arithmetics, basically elements of arithmetics. That's all. So there were nothing about, well, Polish Schule is like a misunderstanding, nothing common with Polish culture or Polish education. So abolished the education system, yes, by shutting down schools and so on, but also plundered Polish galleries, archives, libraries, etc. So it was a great action of looting, mostly works of art, including painting, graphics, craft work, and numismatics. About 30 private collections were also looted by the so-called Grenzschutz, border defense, and also the army. Some of those pieces of art were shipped to various German institutions, others simply just passed into the hands of private owners, and at the same time, all Poles were forbidden to benefit from any collections, museums, and similar institutions. So all institutions concerning culture were closed or were shut down, were changed its purpose, its tasks, and of course, it was forbidden for Poles, for example, to go to the cinema, to theaters. Some Polish books were on the targeted list as the forbidden books, and even, you know, radio stations were closed also. And if anyone would start to listen to, let's say, foreign radio stations, he or she may be sentenced by death. So death penalty was for such an activity. And the last element destroyed numerous historical and cultural monuments, reshaped them in such a way so that they no longer serve the Polish culture, abolished the Polish language from life and education, and restricted its use only to private relations. So there are some examples from the trial, from the verdict. For example, Polish banners and signs were at war with Germans, actually. Not only those posted at the street corners, it was forbidden to put Polish banners, Polish names, Polish language on street corners, in trams, in front of shops, generally public domain, but also signs on mailboxes, on toilets, in bread boxes, found inside private apartments were forbidden. So all those names in Polish language were forbidden, whatever, in private, on public sphere, public domain. So the tribunal found, of course, Gracia guilty of all the charges, and the tribunal highlighted the fact that the number of documents and witnesses proved beyond any doubt that he was a participant in this creation of a special legal state for Poles with regard to education system, language rights, religion, because religion was also targeted in a very strong way. Churches, Catholic churches were closed, were destroyed, and the priests were also under pressure, as targeted persons, victims. And all of these elements actually trace the genocide, equal genocide measures implemented to obliterate Polish culture and science. So this case, the first case of the tribunal, and actually the first case when genocide was invoked, this cultural, as a cultural genocide, as I would like also to underline that it was not included in its final definition of genocide. I think it's kind of a tribute to Rafael Lemkin and his concept, which was broader than its definition. The next case, Amon Get, physical extermination of the Jewish and Polish population, Amon Leopold. I think that you should know more about his brutality and his cruelty, because he was well portrayed in Schindler's List by the British actor Rudolph. So if you know the film, you know what I mean. So he was one of the most brutal and cruel officers, German officers in southern Poland, in General Governorate. But formally, he was a commandant of the 4th Labor Camp in Krakow, Kwiecien, also a member of the Nazi Party and the Waffen-SS, so 2 criminal organizations according to the Tribunal. And the atrocities perpetrated by him satisfied the criteria of physical genocide, performed with the genocidal system masterminded by and implemented by the Third Reich. And particularly, the prosecutors highlighted 4 specific charges. He was accused as a commander of the 4th Labor Camp in Krakow. He caused the death of approximately 8,000 persons who were interned. Then he was responsible also for the final liquidation of ghetto in Krakow. And he conducted also the liquidation of the ghetto in Tarnów, and also in the 4th Labor Camp in Szegnie, progressive liquidation of this labor camp. And I mentioned that he was a very brutal person. So I would also add that he was not only responsible for some orders he gave to his subordinates, but also he was personally responsible for killing, beating people. According to the tribunal, approximately 500 prisoners were killed by him in Kwiecien camp, labor camp, and he did it, like for the sport, I would say. So, for example, one of the methods conducted by him was to shoot at prisoners from the car window, just to, I would say, improve his shooting skills. So without any reason, without any purpose, actually, it's just to shoot at those people. So yeah, he was personally responsible for some orders to deprive freedom, ill-treatment, exterminate individuals, but also accused of having himself murdered, injured, ill-treated Jews, Poles, and other people of other nationalities. And again, as in case of Artur Gleiser, the evidence against God was overwhelming. So included witnesses, mostly former detainees of the ghettos and camps, expert evidence concerning the Nazi policies, and expert legal testimony concerning the content of international criminal law. And the tribunal rejected also any defenses of Goetz, like superior orders, mutual necessity, jurisdictional submissions, and so on, and sentenced him to death. And those acts, his acts, were, I think that we can fit those acts into the framework of killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm, and of course, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction. So again, contemporary definition of genocide and this physical destruction, physical genocide caused by Amon Get, we can compare them and say, yes, it was a genocide at that time, and of course, today, where any tribunal could assess the situation the same way. And the last case, Rudolph Hess, this complex case, because he was the Auschwitz concentration camp commandant, among others, also commander of the SS Garrison at Auschwitz. So again, a member of those criminal organizations, and was charged with membership of the Nazi Party and with membership in the Waffen-SS, and indicted regarding his role at Auschwitz. He supervised the Nazi system of persecution, extermination of nations, and concentration and death camps against Polish, Jewish citizens, but also other nationals of the territories occupied by Germany, and also Soviet prisoners of war. Now, I told you that the case of Rudolph Hess is a mixture of genocide because of the physical character, but also this biological character. I mean, so-called medical experiments conducted at Auschwitz, and those experiments were aimed to impose measures intended.
Professor Marcinko, may I interrupt you? We are kind of running low on time, and I hate
Oh,
to
yes.
do the presentation is so great, but I hope we can share those slides. So, you know, we still have two speakers.
Sorry,
so I apologize, greatly apologize.
Okay,
Such
so
a
yes,
fascinating presentation.
I know.
Can you summarize it for us? You know,
that's
this
true.
is great.
Not a problem. Not a problem. Okay, so I'll just keep to yeah. I think that I start my story. So because there was a project I was involved in, and therefore I had so many issues to explain. So I came to the conclusion, and to conclude the activity of the tribunal. At that time, it was any legal provisions, legal documents concerning Genocide Convention, the concept of Rafael Lemkin, successfully, I think, applied by the tribunal, especially as regards this cultural genocide. The first attempt to deal with it by this tribunal, to implement this concept, and it was also called by the tribunal as a crime lese humanitatis. So the crime lese humanitatis, so the crime against the humanity, actually, the human beings. And the Supreme National Tribunal presented this broader view of the definition, embodying also cultural aspects like planned deliberate destruction of cultural, national, religious heritage, and integrity of identified groups. And also, the tribunal underlined that such destruction of culture, religion, other intellectual assets were not just mere of vandalism or war, robbery, form of kind of retaliation, but these acts were elements of genocide, physical, biological, cultural aspects of them, and it was detailedly planned to the last detail actually by the Nazis. So this genocidal intent was included in the fact that all of these extermination acts and actions were taken and were planned, were prepared, and those accused were were actually participants and executioners of those activities. So thank you very much. Sorry for yes, I know that the time is running. So thank you much for your attention, and I will give the voice to Dr. Zechenter. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Marcinko. This was fascinating. And as you can see, we are building our case. Professor Erickson told us all about, Lemkin and Genocide Convention. Professor Marcinko told us how the Polish National Court interpreted genocide. And now Professor Roman Kwiecien will take us to the international jurisprudence. But before that, let me tell you a little bit about Professor Kwiecien. He is not only a lawyer, but he also studied philosophy, which shows in his work. He's a full professor at the Jagiellonian University in Poland, which is the most prestigious legal department in Poland. He's on the Faculty of Law and Administration, and he's the chair of public international law. In addition, Professor Kwiecien has an active, professional role as an arbitrator at the Permanent Court of Arbitration in Hague, and he's also arbitrator at the Court of Conciliation and Administration within OSCE in Geneva. We are running out of time, so I don't have time to talk about his many publications, but they will be listed on our website, so you can go and read his work. And he again joins us from Krakow, and we'll talk about International Court of Justice. So again, Professor Kwiecien, the floor is yours, and welcome, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you. It is my pleasure to participate in this event. Thank you for the invitation. I think to speak about not so much the crime of genocide as about the prohibition of genocide under the decisions of the International Court of Justice. As known, the prohibition of genocide belongs to the peremptory norms of international law, that is, norms from which no derogation is permitted. Obligations erga omnes stem from such norms. In the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, parties to the convention recognized genocide as an odious scourge and confirmed that genocide was a crime under international law. The question arises, when genocide became a crime, that is a wrongful act under the law. In other words, it is a question of the formal source of the prohibition of genocide. As I said, I would like to answer this question on the basis of the jurisprudence of the International Court of Justice. Just a moment. I hope you can see my presentation. The crucial question is, has this prohibition been binding on states and peoples since the entry into force of the Genocide Convention? Before that, let me make a few remarks about the formal sources of international law, in particular about the relationship between treaties and custom. The long-lasting debate on the sources of international law has not offered an unquestionable answer to the issue of primary formal source of this law. I argue that multilateral treaties are not the primary source, since they are not the self-sufficient source of general international law. That is the law which is effective and opposable erga omnes. There are different approaches to the international lawmaking among scholars. One of them is the source approach, within which the idea of formal sources of law is supported. It seems to me that the formal source approach is worth defending. Why? In my opinion, the idea of formal sources matters for the sake of legal certainty. To put in other words, the idea of formal sources matters because its precise understanding makes possible to determine whether certain rules have acquired legal validity in the process leading to their creation. This process gives the rules legal attachment, that is, it identifies them with the legal order. Using Herbert Hart's statement from The Concept of Law, it is a step from the pre-legal into the legal world. There is no normative hierarchy between the formal sources of international law. However, treaties, especially multilateral treaties with a potential universal scope, are most often associated with the normative core, with the normative basis of international law. Today, many scholars, actually most scholars, believe that modern international relations have made treaties more important tools than the traditional source of international law, that is custom. In consequence, most scholars see treaties as the main measures of the development of international law. In my opinion, this is obviously true for the creation of institutions in the international community. Treaties can promote legal certainty with regard to legal obligations within the international community as well. However, we should have in mind that the opinion on the normative irrelevance of customary law is supported neither by empirical evaluations nor by the decisions of the International Court of Justice. Moreover, there are still highly skeptical views about treaties as the formal sources of international law. A good example is an opinion which we can find in probably the most famous handbook of international law, I mean Oppenheim's International Law. The authors of the last edition of this handbook state that in proper sense, treaties should be regarded as the formal source of legal rights and obligations, but not the law. I share these doubts on treaties. Why? Since treaty regulations cannot establish principles and rules of general international law, that is, norms, opposable and effective order omnes within the legal order. That is why treaties can hardly be acceptable as the formal sources of international law. There are two kinds of provisions in multilateral treaties. On the one hand, the declaratory provisions, and on the other hand, the law-making ones. However, neither the declaratory treaty provisions nor the provisions intended to create new law are formal sources of international law, because the former are just evidence of the normative validity of rules already in force, while compliance with the latter by the parties means simply the performance of treaty obligations. In consequence, it is custom that is the formal source of general international law, not treaties. From customs, not from treaties, follow legal norms opposable to all members of the international community. One can conclude that custom is more than treaty, more even than a generally accepted treaty. I borrowed this phrase from James Crawford's Hague lectures given by him in 2013. Now, so I claim that the prohibition of genocide clearly proves this proposition. The prohibition of genocide follows not from the Genocide Convention, but from custom. Please draw your attention to opinion rules of states regarding genocide prior to the adoption of the Genocide Convention. I mean the General Assembly Resolution of 1946 on genocide. This resolution begins, you can see on your screens that the General Assembly affirms that genocide is a crime, affirms, not creates. This standpoint was repeated in Article 1 of the Genocide Convention. This article stipulates the contracting parties confirm that genocide is a crime under international law, which they undertake to prevent and to punish. Confirm. The Genocide Convention represented a major step in the development of individual criminal responsibility, and it was an important stimulus to claims of universal jurisdiction as well. Besides, the structure of the convention is carried forward in the Rome Statute of the International Court of Justice, Article 6 of this statute. But as I said, the prohibition of genocide itself stems from custom, not from the Genocide Convention. Now it's time to present what the International Court of Justice said of it. There are few important decisions of this court in this respect. First of all, its advisory opinion on the reservation to the Genocide Convention should be underlined. This opinion was given by the ICJ in 1951. In the discuss problem, probably the most important phrase is this one, which you can see on your screens. This is the blue one. I quote: "The principles underlying the convention and are principles which are recognized by civilized nations as binding on states, even without any conventional obligations." What did the ICJ say? The ICJ said that the principles are underlying the Genocide Convention bind on states irrespective of the Pacta Tertis rule. They are legally important beyond the treaty regime, one can say. This standpoint, the ICJ confirmed in its decisions. Two of them you can see on this slide. I mean the judgment of 1996 concerning the dispute between Bosnia and Herzegovina and Yugoslavia. The other one concerns the dispute between Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda, and was given by the court in 2006. In the judgment of 1996, the ICJ underlined that rights and obligations enshrined by the Genocide Convention are rights and obligations erga omnes. It is a really important statement. Now, I would like to address the problem, the relationship between substantive law on genocide and its enforcement. As I said, the prohibition of genocide follows from customary law. The prohibition of genocide exists beyond the treaty regime established by the Genocide Convention. However, treaties based on the consent of the parties are necessary to establish remedies and institutions to enforce this prohibition and responsibility for the crime of genocide. The ICJ strongly supports this proposition. There are a few important judgments given by this court in this respect. The first one, judgment given in the dispute between the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda. The court observed that the erga omnes character of a norm and the rule of consent to jurisdiction are two different things. One can conclude this problem as follows. The prohibition of genocide binds on states irrespective of the Pacta Tertis rule, but the jurisdiction of the ICJ is based on their consent. This proposition was confirmed by the ICJ in other judgments. On this slide, you can see two of them, arrest warrant judgment of 2002, and the other judgment of 2012, jurisdictional immunities of the state concerning the dispute between Germany and Italy. On March 16 this year, the ICJ ordered provisional measures in a dispute between Ukraine and the Russian Federation. After the Russian aggression against Ukraine, Ukraine filed an application instituting proceedings against Russia. Ukraine also submitted a request for the indication of provisional measures. This is an interesting issue, I think, because we can touch here the problem of the so-called prima facie jurisdiction of the court. The ICJ said that when a dispute concerns a treaty which establishes the compulsory obligation of the court needs not to satisfy itself in a definitive manner that it has jurisdiction as regards to the merits to give an order concerning provisional measures. That is why, in this case, the ICJ ordered provisional measures, as I said, on March 16 this year. So let me give three conclusions. The primary conclusion sounds: the legal validity of the prohibition of genocide proves that it is custom that is substantially equivalent to general international law, including Cowden's norms such as the prohibition of genocide. The second conclusion: the consent of states in accepting judicial jurisdiction has its own autonomous legal value. According to the ICJ, there is no normative conflict between Cowden's norms, such as the prohibition of genocide, and the norms concerning the jurisdiction of the court, because the former belongs to the substantive law, while the latter to procedural norms. That is why there is no conflict between them, according to the court. But an important question arises: does it lead to the denial of justice? There is no time to address this problem, but this problem is really important. And the last conclusion: however, the consent of states in accepting jurisdiction is the consent to accede to the system of jurisdiction and thus comply with the requirements of the system. This justifies the prima facie jurisdiction of the ICJ to order provisional measures, what this court did in the case between Ukraine and Russia. But one condition must be fulfilled, namely a dispute must be connected with a treaty which establishes the compulsory obligation of the ICJ. As we know, the Genocide Convention belongs to such treaties. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Kwiecien. That was beautiful presentation. So many questions come to mind, but let me just quickly go to Dr. Ivan Horodysky, because he's the one who can kind of maybe bring it to close. He's joining us from Ukraine in Lviv right now. He is the director of the Dnistrianskyi Center for Law and Politics and a practicing lawyer. And he actually he's co-author of a book on Lemkin too, but the war prevented the publication of the book. And the book, I understand, is coming out both in Ukrainian and in English in Canada. So we have this book to look forward. But meanwhile, Ivan, if you can bring it to a close, tell us what's happening in Ukraine, how can we apply all the law on genocide or crimes against humanity, in fact, to what's happening right now in Ukraine. So the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much. So the publication was postponed, and hopefully it will take place in the nearest months. I think it's co-authored by me and by Dr. Marcin, who is former senior lawyer of the European Court of Human Rights. So first of all, thank you very much to Elizabeth for such an opportunity to present to such a high-level audience my presentation. In our book, together with Marcin, we referred to some of colleagues which are here on the same, which are panelists, and which I see among the participants. So it's really glad to be present here. Okay, let me share my screen. Yeah. So first of all, I should say that generally speaking, this topic of pre-war, pre-Second World War lawyers and law research in Lviv, in Galicia, which was part of Poland in those times, is very close to me, and Professor Stanisław Dnistrianskyi, after whom our center is named, was also living and working in Lviv in the same time, together with Herschel Uterpacht, Louison, Rafael Lemkin, and many others. Nowadays, after the February 21st, after the tragic events of the beginning of the Russian aggression, the word genocide is very widely used among Ukraine and the Ukrainian context. It is used both by the Ukrainian politicians and by general Ukrainian as a description of what is happening right now, even in these minutes, hours, and so on. So we are living as in the siege fortress, and no one knows what will happen next hour. For example, will there be a shelling? Will there be some blackout, etc.? And but as many words, so genocide has not one meaning or not one definition. So we have at least two of them. One is a definition suggested by Rafael Lemkin, and second one is a definition which is formal one, and which was partially described. Both definitions were partially described by previous panelists. But I will try in my presentation to describe why the definition and the vision and the concept of crime was genocide by Rafael Lemkin is very important for Ukraine and Ukrainians right now, and even for the world at all. So first of all, as Elizabeth mentioned, Rafael Lemkin studied in Lviv, he lived in Lviv. On this photo, you can see one of his houses, one of his addresses in where he lived. There were three such addresses. This is why I have chosen this one, because I'm every day crossing this house when I'm going from my home to work. But this is his last address in Lviv, at the, maybe not last, but last known, at the Zamarstynivska Street. So to say, when we're coming back to the topic of genocide against Ukrainians, there is a very big problem of definition, legal definition, what is happening right now. It's very easy to say by politicians, to say by ordinary people, to say even by lawyers that genocide is happening. But lawyers who are practicing, and many of our colleagues here and among panelists and participants are legal practitioners, they know that besides just giving a name or defining, you need to prove that what is happening. So for all the events, we can definitely say that after February 21st, there were a lot of war crimes committed by Russians against Ukrainians, both in Bucha, Izium, Kherson, many other cities. With also high level of proof and confidence, we can say that there were crimes against humanity happening. So this concept suggested by Herschel Uterpacht, another lawyer from Lviv and prominent national lawyer 20th century. But when we're talking about genocide and the genocide is happening, we are facing or will face a number of problems to prove really prove that the genocide was happening and is happening right now in Ukraine. And this is also because the burden of proof in genocidal cases is very high, but also, and it requires not only to say that, look, that to show the quantity of crimes that happened, quantity of killings or quantity of other things, but it is needed to show the systematic character of what was happening, and it's needed to show the intention, not only to just to kill or just to kill group of people, but to kill group of people or destroy group of people because they were Ukrainians or other representative of other national ethnic group. When we're talking about also genocide and genocide in Ukraine, so there are a lot of, besides lawyers and besides politicians, there are a lot of other people who are saying and trying to justify that really that we can talk about genocide in Ukraine. Professor Timothy Snyder, a prominent American lawyer and very good and deep specialist on the history of Ukraine, he suggested 6 arguments of why we can say that Russia is committing genocide against Ukraine. And so when we see it, so you can all see these arguments are used by Putin's regime, by Putin's media persons, political experts, etc. So it's descriptions that Ukraine is not a state, there is no Ukrainian people as a special separate nation. There is a description of Ukrainians as a Nazis, and even it's in terms of international humanitarian law, they are denying any standards towards Ukrainian soldiers because they are so-called Nazis, and which require denazification, whatever it means. Also it's denial about that Holodomor and other Soviet repressions had happened. It's the replacement ID, and it's deliberately overloading the system, trying to make things hard to understand it. So the last 2 things are very important because Russians are always using it. So they are using arguments, counter-arguments, and in this mixture, no one knows what to say. And sometimes it's even very hard to deal with all falsification, IDs, counter-IDs, and to define, clearly say what is happening. But if we are taking a look at the Russian actions, we will see that they are not only aiming, so to say, to make aggression or to seize Ukraine new territories, so seize part of Ukraine or to occupy of Ukraine. They are systematically doing things to destruct Ukrainian nation, both in physical and both in mental way. So you can see one of the picture of library which was destroyed by shelling. Of course, it was not. Maybe I think it's. I cannot be sure that it was destroyed intentionally, but generally we are receiving a lot of information that Russians are, besides mass killings, besides forcible deportations of both children and adults from Ukraine, even prisoners are forcibly deported to Russia. So we are seeing that they are trying to destroy libraries, destroy Ukrainian books. They are banning and prosecuting because of using of Ukrainian language. They are forcing people to leave if they don't want to accept Russian citizenship, etc. Many other things which are not always connected with physical killing, with killing of humans, but they are definitely connected with the destruction of nation and destruction of its destruction of its nature. But from this point of view, if we, as legal practitioner, I can say that maybe we see a lack of proofs that all these war crimes committed can consist as a can be proved to be a genocide before, I don't know, ICC or other international courts. They may say, and judges may say, yes, we are seeing here war crimes or crimes against humanity, but we are seeing lack of proofs that this is a genocide. But when we are taking into account all the systematic actions, all these statements which we are hearing, that there can be no Ukraine, there are no separate Ukrainian nation, no language, that the Ukrainian churches, Orthodox Church should be banned, etc. So that we can see a clear intention to destroy Ukraine as a nation, as a state. And by this we can, with more confidence, talk about genocide. But as here was mentioned, and I think all the panelists and participants may know, the UN Genocide Convention has very strict frames of what we can consider to be a genocide. And very simplifying it, we can say that according to the UN Genocide Convention, only those actions which are envisaging some physical harm, killing, wounding, forcibly transferring of children, etc., may cause a genocide, but not a banning of, but not the actions which are against language, against religion, against nation, against some traditions, etc. And this is, the first speaker has very good and very brilliant said that this was perhaps one of the main reasons of disappointment of Rafael Lemkin after the convention of the Genocide Convention was adopted, because this is a very narrow vision and of what he envisaged and what he suggested to be a genocide. And if we are seeing, if we are taking a look at the convention on as a definition suggested by Rafael Lemkin, we can see that by genocide he envisaged that this can be a destruction of nation or ethnic group, a coordinated plan of different actions. So, and these different actions were not only against life or health or other things of human being, but also against foundations of life. Against and the main aim was to destroy a pattern, destroy the identity, and this is exactly what we are seeing right now in Ukraine. On the, fortunately, very fortunately, on the occupied territories, only there. But at the beginning, after the first days, in the first days after February 21st, everyone in every corner of Ukraine was shocked and didn't know what to expect. Also, Lemkin, in this talking about the concept of Lemkin, so first of all, he envisaged much more broader range of methods of genocide. So besides physical methods, he envisaged that he suggested that there can be political, social, cultural, economic, biological, physical, religious, moral, many other methods of genocide, and also a much more broader scope of groups who can be identity, nation, pattern, foundations of which can be a aim of genocide. So this could be national, ethnical, social, cultural, political, religious groups. Due to different reasons, different positions, both Stalin, both Brazilian, etc., and many others, these suggestions were not accepted. So definitely maybe the great powers and general international community in 1945 was not ready to accept such a broad definition. But 75 years after Russians gives a, and not only Russians, so by many in many other parts of the world we can see very similar actions, for example China and Uyghurs, other things. So we are seeing that Lemkin was right. So Lemkin's vision was maybe not fully understandable in 1945, 1948, but it was right, because both Russia's actions in Ukraine and maybe other authoritarian regimes in other parts of the world, they may not always have as an outcome a killing of people or group of people, but they can have an aim to destruct the identity and foundations of their groups, or of them as a group of people. And that's why this is, for me, a main value of Lemkin's idea and Lemkin's concept. In these hard times, when democracy, when freedom are under great danger, it gives an opportunity not to create something new, not to rethink, but come back to the roots and take them to reconsider the crimes and reconsider their nature. But this ambiguity when we are talking about genocide is very seen even in political way. So, for example, it was very great noted that when we're hearing about or saying genocide, even from officials, even from public persons, they may use it not always in line with the definition of which is contained in the UN Genocide Convention, but it is much more in line with the vision of Rafael Lemkin. And that is one more argument that Lemkin's vision and concept should be taken into account, and later on should the question of reconsidering or rewriting a definition of genocide should be put on the agenda of the international community. But as for now, we are on very great risk, as both my colleagues from international law, they also may know, may recognize it or may discuss it, that at the end of the day, when there will be a, so to say, tribunal court, which will define what were the Russian actions in Ukraine? Was it genocide? Was it crimes against humanity, or simply war crimes? The idea, the decisions that they were genocide, there is a big chance that it won't be accepted, and there will be some other definition. And Professor Philip Sands, whom was mentioned by Elizabeth, unfortunately he couldn't join today, he also very clearly noted it in his April's column for New York Times, that this could be a very big disappointment. So we are talking a lot about genocide, but we need to understand that final aim of justice and final result should be not kind of contest, to name it, and that these actions will be recognized as a genocide. For me, as a Ukrainian, and for many Ukrainians, the main thing is that these actions should be punished. Not only in case of Putin's regime, but in case of many other people and many other regimes in other parts of the world. Here in Ukraine, even in my city, Lviv, on the streets, we can see people from all over the world who are coming here as volunteers. Some of them are joining International Legion. It's a special unit of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, official one when they are fighting. And this means that this fight for freedom and democracy is very valuable. And the justice is the main aim. But as I say, is also the situation with crimes in Ukraine, is it clearly shows that we need to reconsider the definition of genocide and its official definition. And Rafael Lemkin views and Rafael Lemkin ideas is a great opportunity, is a great ground to start this process. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ivan, and thank you to all our speakers. I am in a very unhappy situation because there are so many questions that come to mind, and such a fantastic discussion could just happen right now, but I don't know if we have any time. Olivia, can we continue for like 10 more minutes, or is it not possible? Would Zoom cut us off?
No, Zoom will not cut us off. We can go
Okay,
on.
great. So let's start with a couple of questions. I don't think we have to respect our audience. If you guys have to drop off, do, because I understand that we said an hour and a half and we're running over time, but because this will be available as a recording on the Zoom, on a YouTube, we can actually maybe bend the rules a bit and ask a few questions, because there are many questions. First of all, I'm not sure, maybe I'll just ask it generally and you guys choose which one of you wants to answer it, but we already have shown that there are many different crimes, and it might be a huge injustice and a very bad precedent if we talk about genocide but end up not prosecuting either the crime or various crimes, or let the perpetrators get free in Ukraine and also in other jurisdictions. I mean, we had some questions from the audience about what about other cases of genocides that are happening all over the world. And since we are focusing narrowly now on Europe, because we cannot focus on everything, there are two questions, which crimes to prosecute, the differences, why, and the history, and also the jurisdictional issue that Professor Kwiecien so aptly raised, because, it really is about jurisdiction at this point as well, not just the definition of the crime. So which one of you would like to kind of like give us a general overview? Where do you think this is going? I mean, what are the best our chances of prosecuting the Russians? And how shall we go about it? Because this is a really key question. Just raise your hand and just go for it, please. Go, Doug. Your question is up. Go for it. Just unmute yourself. You are muted.
So as somebody who is not a lawyer, maybe I can go first and I can get corrected by the rest of the panelists. Personally, I just want to thank Dr. Horodysky for that, the final conclusion there. The point that I think is looking as a historian of law and international law, not as a lawyer to say that definition. I do think there is tremendous flexibility by national jurisdictions and national level criminal justice mechanisms broadly defined to prosecute genocide in ways that are more meaningful for the local context. I think the Argentinian experience demonstrates this absolutely perfectly, where they went back and they read Lemkin. And I think this is, the last presentation discussed this. And to a certain degree, I would hope that this kind of a process would take place in Ukraine in a way that also has deep connections to civil society, that begins to talk about the larger picture, because there are two words genocide. There's the legal term, which is very, very, very different than what the term is used by activists and human rights activists actually a lot. And so we can talk about genocides of Rohingya and genocides of Uyghurs, as we have an anonymous question that was submitted in the chat that I see here. Yes, we can talk about genocides of European of asylum seekers going into Europe, right? But by and large, my reading of the history of the drafting of the Treaty of the Genocide Convention was that states wanted to exclude a huge portion of the kinds of oppression that states commit against their own populations from the definition of genocide, and they succeeded in that by and large. So it would be extraordinarily difficult to prosecute Russia for genocide in Ukraine, just as it would be extraordinarily difficult to prosecute China for committing genocide against the Uyghur population, or to prosecute the US for committing genocide against Native American Indian reservations and policies, or even in Myanmar for genocide against Rohingya. So I think there's a divergence there about communities that pick up the term and use it. I think for memory and for political science and sociology and history, the term can be used. And in Ukraine, I would very much like to see a domestic process that's attached to domestic courts, because that has the greatest ability to be in communication with civil society and different groups in Ukraine. So as the non-lawyer, I will mute myself, and I will allow myself to be corrected and amended by my colleagues who hold law degrees and know much more about this.
Thank you, Doug. How about our legal audience, legal speakers? Professor Kwiecien, Marcinko, przepraszam. You raised your hand.
Yes, as while listening to presentations of all my colleagues, my distinguished colleagues, especially Dr. Horodysky, I was trying to find any connections, any comparison between the case I analyzed, the topic I analyzed, those cases of the Polish tribunal and the current situation in Ukraine. And I have some remarks. I hope that it might be also treated as a general remarks for other cases. And well, again, I will return to the opinion of Dr. Irvin-Erickson concerning this genocidal intent, which is so essential in any attempts to say that this or that crime is or is not genocide. So in cases I analyzed, we had that huge evidence on those so-called objective elements of genocide I presented here. And of course, but also genocidal intent concerning the plan, the extermination plan, such slogans like Lebensraum, Hosten, and so on. So the plan to Germanize all Slavic nations and to eradicate Jewish population from those territories. So I think that in case of Ukraine, again, we have many evidence, so many evidence of various crimes, not only, well, let's say genocide, but also, and that's for sure, and I agree with Dr. Horodysky, war crimes, crime against humanity, we are sure that they are committed and we can name them. And I think that all investigative teams, international Ukrainian teams, are overwhelmed by those evidence of many crimes. But how to find this essential element concerning intent? Dr. Horodysky mentioned some proofs of Timothy Snyder, as far as I remember, and among others, there were the question of that Russian would like to get rid of Ukrainians from their territory. And it reminds me that Germanization, it was also, according to Hitler's plan, was also about territory, not about people. So Germanization means, okay, so we have to, to broaden our Lebensraum, our area to live. And what about people? Who cares, actually? They should be eliminated. They should be exterminated. With many methods and means, including prevent birth and so on. So I think that for the Ukrainian nation and then for this case, we have to think about this genocide intent, how to find it, where to find it, and probably the call of President Zelensky to recognize Russian Federation as a terrorist state might be the first step. Who knows? To think about the criminal organizations like Kremlin, like some institutions, state institutions, which prepare this war, which conduct this war. Right now, we have the resolution of the European Union concerning Russian Federation recognizing it as a state which sponsors terrorism. I think it's not the same as terrorist state, but perhaps again, it's like a first step, first attempt to change the situation. So both in case of Ukraine and in other cases invoked today, as regards other attempts to name such crimes, some crimes as genocide, I think that this genocidal intent, most difficult issue actually to prove. However, we have some cases of ad hoc tribunals concerning this issue, so they might be helpful, might facilitate this difficult task. Okay, I think that's all for now. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you. Either Professor Kwiecien or Ivan, do you want to say anything, or should I bring us to the next question? Up to you. Okay, so I'll bring us to the next question. So one administrative comment. Professor Snyder, who is historian, is teaching right now a course on history of Ukraine, which is available on YouTube. He made it free to everybody. There are millions of viewers. I think he has 3 million students, which is unbelievable. And he has been sanctioned by Russia. So imagine the efforts of trying to stifle the free speech in America by teaching history of Ukraine. He is being sanctioned by Russia. So this is just amazing by itself. But we will post the link. So you can all go. All our audience, you can go and those lectures are fabulous. They are amazing. The second question I have is more legal. And that is the question of special tribunal. Of course, there are special tribunals. It's a very difficult question because whether it should be, national court in Ukraine, but then there is a question, how can they get jurisdiction over those Russians who are committing the crimes? And if this is under auspices of UN, that also is complicated because United States is of not one mind. As you know, there are different opinions on the special tribunal and what it means. And as you know, United States doesn't recognize jurisdiction of the ICC, for example, and so on. So would anybody want to take up this issue of how can we get to the international tribunal, of some sort, special tribunal, and what are the chances of that happening anytime soon?
If I may, international international tribunal for whom?
For those who are committing the crimes, mostly Russians at this point.
And for what?
Who committed
exactly.
crimes during this conflict. I'm afraid that without the consent of the Security Council, the UN Security Council, it will not be rather possible, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
This is my opinion. First of all, I think the most important thing is the crime of aggression.
Mm-hmm.
The crime of aggression. The Russian Federation as a state committed an act of aggression, but the crime was committed by concrete people. And responsibility for this crime, it's a really important thing. Without that, I don't think that most people suspicious to commit war crimes against humanity, and even genocide will stand before courts, national or international courts. I don't think. The crime of aggression, we cannot forget about this crime. The crime of aggression is actually crime of the crime, I can say. So, in this sense that it is the beginning of armed conflict and so on and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. I have to agree with you. And if we were not to prosecute the crime of aggression, then what is the whole purpose of the United Nations? Because United Nations is kind of founded on the foundation that states should live peacefully, and this would be the end of all the aggression which we've seen in Europe. So that was the whole premise of United Nations Charter. And if we don't prosecute crime of aggression, as you said, what's the point of having United Nations at this point? Professor Kwiecien, you are muted.
But there is no judicial forum to prosecute the crime of aggression. The International Criminal Court has no jurisdiction for this crime. Unfortunately, no, because neither Ukraine nor the Russian Federation is a part to the statute of the ICC. So, and we must remember that I'm afraid that national criminal courts unfortunately don't have jurisdiction over the crime of aggression, because the crime of aggression is committed by people who have power to control a given state. In the international legal order is such thing as personal immunities. Personal immunities protect head of state, chief of government, and minister for foreign affairs. Yeah, so there is no jurisdiction to prosecute the crime of aggression, neither before international courts nor national courts. Unfortunately not.
Well, thank you. So I guess we have to leave at that because we are at 2 hours mark, and I have this very unhappy job of closing and bringing this webinar to close. But I want to thank all our speakers. This was so fascinating, such incredible presentation, so many different points of view, such great scholarship. We are all in awe and very thankful to you and very honored you joined our webinar. We will post the recording on our website. We will list your vitas and your publications so people can go and read your work. And we have a part 2 in January. And thank you so very much. I'm very personally grateful to all of you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Yes, thank you.
And perhaps we can continue our discussion next time.
I hope so. I hope so. Thanks so much.